Hi Internet, my name is Tim Downs, and this is part 2 out of 2 videos I'm releasing going over the Coolio 2.0 upgrade. In the first video, I went over just how he works, what each different layer and controller does, and in this one, I'm going to sort of geek out a little bit over all the really fun things that I came up with and found with some help doing some research, following some tutorials, taking some inspiration from more industry standard rigs and more professional rigs that you'd usually see in Maya, and just how I tried to take as much as I could from what I learned and try to build upon the first version of the rig. And so I just really wanted to share, a few of the really interesting parts that I think were interesting and fun to make and could be useful in your own rigs if you try to make something similar. I think there's a few special things going on in this little guy here. There's more than meets the eye, so to speak. So I just wanted to show a few things. I'm not really even writing a script for this video. I just wanted to kind of go through everything that I really liked about making him and how I try to make him a lot better than the first Coolio, which I'm still proud of, but he had a lot of room for improvement. Anyway, without further ado. So first and foremost, I really want to go over the face. The face rig in the first version was not the best it could have been. I'm a little embarrassed by it, but it's still usable. You can still achieve really good poses with it. But with this, I decided instead of using bendy bones and armature deform for the mouth, to use shape keys. But I didn't just use shape keys. I did use 2 bones for the lips, as you can see here. They completely deform the upper and lower lip. Well, actually, they might be a little hidden right now. I can't remember if this... they're actually constrained to these mechanism bones, but the idea is that this bone controls the entirety of the upper lip, and this one, the entirety of the lower lip, and they follow these mechanism bones to achieve this control here, where you can switch between a sort of closed mouth jaw movement versus an open mouth jaw movement, without having to, this is really the best way that I can think of, actually, that does this. Even Maya rigs that I've seen ported into Blender, they don't have this kind of setup. It might be hard to port over those constraints or something. There's something about porting Maya rigs, on top of many other things, that just make that kind of difficult. So in here, I decided to set it up in Blender all on my own. This is used in some other rigs I've seen and some tutorials I've found on Blender that were very helpful. I'll be linking everything that I used as resource or inspiration, or some tutorials I've followed as well, to try to sort of figure out my own method of building this for Coolio. So that's all that really deforms the mouth in the armature, whereas everything else is shape keys as opposed to bendy bones. I just found that building shape keys individually just made everything a little bit nicer, and I didn't have to make so many corrective shape keys this time, so I could easily just make all of these shapes and then correct everything. Like if you move the mouth up, it has a correction for like when it gets really too far up, and same for way off to the side, and all of that, just so that way everything works much more nicely. You can get, some good combinations of poses with this mouth as opposed to the last one. And what else is there? Well, I used a similar concept in the first version of Coolio's face that, let the eyes and eyebrows always stick to the surface of the head. Now, this uses a shrink wrap bone constraint. You can actually shrink wrap bones to the surfaces of objects. It kind of works like rivets do in Maya, the way you can set up a rivet bone, so that way it always follows the surface of an object. You can also sort of put it in between 2 other bones to sort of stay in between the 2, which is kind of how I did this. Well, you can't see the mechanism bone here on this layer, but the way it stays right in the center, sort of a similar concept to how you can always have something staying exactly where it should be. But with this, it uses shrink wrap. And the way that works is a little more complicated than it might actually seem too, because if you open the mouth, and you move the eyes all the way down, you can see that it actually sort of just floats outside there as if there is no mouth. The way that I got this to work, because if it didn't work like that, then the eye bone would actually just automatically snap inside of his mouth or onto the like inside part on this surface over here, and it would just stick to it would disappear basically. The way I avoided that is a method that I'm actually really proud of. I've sort of thought of this on my own, and then I realized that some other riggers do the same thing in other concepts. I think the irises on the really cartoony eyes that I believe it's Lightning Boy Studios did, in order to keep the irises onto the ball of the eye, no matter how much the eye distorts. They created a sort of a hidden wireframe object that has the same exact shape and the same deformations, minus some different changes here, so that way it will always stay there. Anyway, so this head is just a duplicate from the model. I'm sorry I have all these other shapes here, but I'm going to focus on the head. It has the exact same deformations as the base head, except it doesn't have a mouth. So if we go back into pose mode, you can see that even though his mouth does not open in this hidden shape, it still has every other bit of deformation. It even has the cheek puffing out and all of that. This was, it took me a little bit of figuring out, but basically I was able to just duplicate it, change out that little bit of the mesh. You can't change too much or else it's going to really mess up when you start using these shape keys. It makes sense, because if you have two different models with the same shape keys, then the things are not going to look exactly the same. So I kept it as similar as I could as possible to the main Coolio character mesh. And so all of the bones for things like the eyes and the lips follow this geometry. The same, like I said, applies to the lips as well, which is how you get these really nice, smooth movements that always conform to the curvature of the head. It's also shape keys, so I try to make sure that every full shape key kind of curved that way. But the same applies as well to the bones for the teeth. That's how they're able to stay inside the mouth at all times. You can go in and turn down the shrink wrap modifier, but it'll start to move in some ways that you might not want it to if you do that, but it can also allow you to move them in and out if you want some sort of like F or TH kind of mouth poses. So this was, I'm pretty happy with how this came out. The same also works with the chin controller. I even sort of changed the mesh just a little bit. It has the same number of vertices except for the mouth and all of that, but I sort of pushed this outward a little bit so that way it would deform a little bit more to my liking. I tried messing around with the weight maps for this deformer bone down here, but with such a simple mouth, he doesn't have a very humanoid topology for his face. It's just a ball with some inset faces for his mouth, which, because he's so cartoony, that's really all he needed. But for the chin down here, I could have tried, or I did try making the weight painting here a little bit more, just a little more pretty. But with this slightly edited sort of hidden cage around his head, it was easier to just sort of keep the shrink wrap modifier on and the weight painting just the same without having to mess around with that, so that way it could slightly hang out in the front, kind of like a real chin without the jaw moving entirely. So, and the same goes for up here on the eyebrows, and like I said in the first video, they are slightly turned down on the shrink wrap modifier, just so that way, because this is a NURBS curve, the eyebrows, sometimes things get a little weird when it stretches really far out, like you can see here. But if you have to move all of the controllers together, it starts to work a little bit better. It stretches pretty far, but as it's a simple NURBS curve, or a Bezier curve rather, it doesn't completely cooperate, but then you can just move it up on the y-axis, and then it'll just work great. So it'll still follow the curvature of this cage head, but slightly offset from it because it's been turned down a little bit, so that way you get that little bit of extra control, so it doesn't always clip through the head. So that covers the face and the mouth, and these basic mouth poses were set up with just action constraints. So these bones all have action bone constraints, which basically makes it so if you're not familiar with animating in Blender or rigging in Blender, it's sort of like creating a shape key but with the pose of a bone. But it's called an action because it's the movement of a bone rather than the shape of it. So you get this different poses you can set up with your bones, and then constrain that to the movement of something like the x-axis of some controller bone here, or the z-axis. And it could be offset as well, so that's how you can move the jaw down with the lip sync, and then still be able to sort of rotate the jaw on your own with the jaw controller. So that is a much better setup, I think, than the first Coolio's mouth and face rig. It's just it's prettier. You don't have to worry about the y-axis for any of these, except for the middle bones, which just push them out a little bit. It'll clip through the cage here, but it's small enough that it doesn't really matter. It doesn't really do anything. So if I were to move the eyes here for some reason, I can't think of any reason why you would want to. I'm having a hard time because it's in this perspective, but yeah, it doesn't seem to really matter that much because you're never, I can't think of an instance where you're going to pose his face like this. So it just sticks on pretty smoothly, and I use target normal project. If you're going to use this similar concept for your own rig, target normal project kind of is a happy medium for how it sticks to the surface. Nearest vertex is going to snap around a bit. Same goes for nearest surface point. Project, I can't quite remember why I didn't always use that. I think it's from the perspective of the bone itself, so yeah, it kind of gets a little weird when you use that. So target normal project, it just follows the normals of each face on here, and it sort of conforms to that. And you can set the alignment so that way it's always pointing directly out. So if these bones are on the surface, then you, as you might guess, the teeth stay inside the surface, sort of giving a very rough explanation for how the shrink wrap modifier works in Blender rigging. But if it stays inside, then it will not just stick to the surface, but it'll have like a hard limit when you try to move it outside of this cage that I've hidden, so it can always keep the teeth inside. But like I said, you can turn it down. You can get a little more control on the y-axis from the local orientation of these bones. So that is now, I think, the face. That's the face rig. So I'm going to go ahead and hide all of these control shapes. That's the collection that I put that cage in, as well as where I built all of these custom bone shapes, just for a nicer UI for all of this. Now, the limbs and especially the tweak bones that I built here, they're called tune, I believe, in the hierarchies and all of this. I just named them that because you can get really cartoony poses as well, but they're really also just for getting just a tiny bit of adjustment in like your silhouettes. The way this works is so much better, I think, than it was in the first version of Coolio. In the first version, it was all just lattice deformations on various parts of him. So I just built lattices and constrained them to vertices on the mesh, and then just applied those to bones in the armature. And you could kind of get the same effect, but it is really not as good as this. So on the arms, if I unhide all of that, you have bendy bones. Bendy bones are pretty great in Blender. The main downside to them I found is when you start to twist them, they get really weird. I'll get to that in a second though. And you cannot export them to other software. Bendy bones are a very Blender specific thing, so you can't really export them. But I've got some stretch 2 constraints on all of these 4 bendy bones here throughout the arms. The same goes on the right side, of course, so I'm going to focus on this side. So that's how they stretch to all of these controllers. The way I was able to achieve this sort of Bezier-like control by scaling the tweak bones in and out was I just created some drivers for the bendy bone settings. If I go here, you can see I set up some drivers for the ease in and ease out. That's what controls like the steepness or the width of the arc between bendy bones on the end or the in and out of each bone. So by default, these are set up in such a way that when you bend it at the elbow, it's always going to be a like totally sharp easing between the two, which is -1 in Blender. So in the drivers here, you'll see that it's, if I can open it up here, it's just the average scale of this controller -1, or -2 rather, because this is a scale of 1. So this makes it so that way, by default, it's always at -1, but once you scale it up, it'll go higher, and that will make this value increase. Sort of a simple little driver equation. And for these, I see I've got it. Oh, this is also at -1 around the wrist, so that way you get a nice sharp bend at the wrists. And it's pretty much this whole setup down the line of all of these bendy bones. And in order to achieve a proper twist at the wrist, this was a little bit trickier than just using bendy bones. You might find in some tutorials, like on Dicko, he demonstrated different methods of getting really nice, twisty, cartoony layouts for arms, specifically in one video. And it might lead you to believe that just a bendy bone roll will make the wrist twisting issue disappear. Not necessarily true. Unfortunately, excuse me, I just got a text. Unfortunately, doesn't totally work right off the bat when you do that, especially when you have multiple bendy bones like this down the line of the arm. Instead of 2 bones, we have 4 here, so we can have these various points of control. What I did to get around that, and it's hard to see now because I set it up in a way that fixed it, but basically the way I set it up was I added, I believe it was a constraint. It copies the rotation of this hand tweak control. It really moves the entire hand as well because it parents the hand deformation to it, just so you can get cartoonish tweaking control directly from the wrist onward. But I digress. It follows the Y local rotation of the hand. So that way you get just a little bit more of this slight easing out of the twist at the wrist all the way down to the elbow, rather than just right here in the middle of the forearm, because otherwise that's when you start getting some weird behaviors going on when you twist something far enough. And even as it is right now, when you twist this far enough, bendy bones are going to do their thing where they just snap and kind of break a bit. There's no way around this that I'm aware of, honestly, with bendy bones, because they all move along a chain, excuse me, and they, even if you parent them with offset, they're still going to act a little weird when you twist them too far. But I thought that this was a happy medium because the wrist, realistically, even if this isn't a very realistic character, it's never going to twist all the way around. You're not going to often find yourself in a position where you need the hand to go around 360 degrees. It's a small sacrifice, in my opinion, even if this is a relatively cartoony, stylized rig. But not all of it is bendy bones. In fact, those are the only part of it that are bendy bones. The rest of it is something that I definitely did take a lot of information away from by following some tutorials and looking at how the same systems are set up in Maya. Maya doesn't have bendy bones, or if they do, then it's something slightly different, and they of course call it something different. But really, the standard for getting this kind of movement in Maya uses splines or spline IK, which you can do in Blender. It's even called the same thing, just to give you an idea. I believe it starts from here. No, it starts from here. Or are these the transform bones or the deformation bones? Let's see. Yep, you see here. I've got this chain of like mechanism bones that follow a spline IK. The spline itself, this Bezier, is up in the control shapes collection in that giant mess. So I'm not going to unhide that. But rest assured, there is a spline going down the spine here, which is a bit of a tongue twister. I found the spine. And then I parented the actual deform bones to this mechanism chain. And I will definitely link Dicko's spline IK based spine rig tutorial. Like I said, it's kind of a mouthful, but I love this setup for the spine. I think that this is pretty much how I'm going to rig every spine from now on, because it was simpler to set up even than with bendy bones. You would think that with something sort of tailor-made for Blender, like bendy bones, it would actually be a little bit easier, but you'll find in one of his other tutorials that I tried to take some notes on and realized that it's probably more trouble than it's worth to use bendy bones for this, because you have to build all sorts of weird utilities and mechanism bones in between each bendy bone joint all along it, so that way you can get them to point and twist and rotate exactly where they should. Whereas with this setup, it's just this one right here. That's it. You'll see the comparison between using spline IK and bendy bones for the spine. It's night and day, just how much simpler it is for this. So all this does is, like I mentioned before, it keeps the midsection of the spine exactly in the middle between this upper spine controller and the hips. So if I were to move this control up here, you'll see that it not only points directly at the chest, or it will also stay exactly like 50-50 in between the two. That way you can move this without having to worry about moving it up and down the y-axis every time you move this upper spine controller. Gets a nice little bit of automation there. Now, another wonderful thing about this setup is that if I were to go into edit mode and show you this may look a little confusing, of course, because it doesn't have the custom controllers visible in edit mode. That's just the way Blender works with that. But we've got this IK and the center of gravity, and let's see here, we've got the hips. And up here, we've got the spine IK up here, spine mid. So these are all set up. If you took a really close look at the relations between all of these bones, it's very particular how these have to be set up. But basically, you don't even need a IK constraint on these controllers in the spine. I call them IK because it is essentially it works like an IK joint chain here, the way you've got it, but it doesn't have any pull target because the spine has no pull target. It doesn't have a joint like an elbow or a knee, so you're always going to move the top control or the bottom control around sort of independently of each other. But this, I believe, the middle IK bone is parented to this FK bone with offset. So it's a really beautiful layout, I think. And I don't know if you could say I totally stole this from Dicko in his tutorials. I think that this is sort of a good system that can be applied to any rig with a spine, which I can't imagine a rig of a character without a spine, but you know what I'm saying. This is a much simpler layout than if you were to use bendy bones, and it deforms a lot better than if you just had an FK chain going all the way up here. So I just wanted to show that as well. Big shout out to Dicko. He's a wonderful, or is it Ditko? Did I just call him a bad name? I don't know. I can't remember. I have a terrible memory for names. I'm sorry. But like I said, this is supposed to be a little bit more of a casual episode or video, just to sort of let me gush over my own work. I'm not saying it's the best rig in the universe, but I took a lot from what I've learned, borrowed some ideas, and applied it to this simple guy as best I could. So, yes. What else is there that I'd like to show? You might notice if you had the first Coolio rig, or honestly, you can kind of notice it right off the bat if you download this version. He has no neck. He has no neck bone. He just has this deformer here for like his upper spine / rib cage / sort of sternum up here. He doesn't really have a rib cage because he's so doughy and rubbery. But basically, I just went straight from the spine to the head. The reason for that is because I realized that it was a little bit too much going on here for such a simple character. He barely has a neck, and I thought that I think that's a corner worth cutting for a character of this type with such a stickman kind of structure. There's no point in giving him a neck. He can still move his head, turn his head, rotate it, and you'll still pretty much get a proper control over your poses for it. So I thought that was a smart move, I think. I don't know. Maybe you can't get him to sort of bob his head side to side, but if you were to move the upper spine or move the shoulders independently of that, you can still sort of get the same effect as that. I just think that it was getting a little cluttered up here with how little geometry he has. If you go into wireframe mode, even with subdivisions, he's got such a basic topology to everything that I didn't think a neck bone was really necessary for him. And speaking of having too many bones, I realized the hard way. If you are going to try to make some spline IK systems in your own rig, make sure that you don't have too many bones on that chain. It's tempting to try to get something like you see here with the bendy bones, to have all of these individual pieces of this chain, but that won't work so great with spline IK. And the reason for that is, well, I mean, if you have a low poly model with a very, very dense rig with a lot of bones, Blender isn't going to like that. It's not going to know what to do with some of the vertices that you've weight painted to all of these bones, and it will start to glitch, for lack of a better term. So when I first built this spine, I gave him all, like 32 bones down this chain. But if you go into wireframe and look at him, he doesn't have 32 edge loops down his torso. So there were a few parts here when I tried to weight paint it that would just permanently stay red no matter what I did, no matter which bones I selected or deselected and tried to adjust the weight painting. It would always be at 100% deformation, like especially around the hips, because I had spline IK down the legs, which I'll get to in a second, and spline IK down the spine. So when they started to intersect around here, Blender just didn't know what to do with some of his geometry and what to parent which vertex to which bone. So when you're building a spline IK 4-character rig, make sure it's better to have too few than too many. Of course, you want to be, you want to maximize the amount that you can have so you get this really nice, smooth, Bezier curve-like movement throughout your spine. But if you have too many, it's going to freak out on you and break. And then you're going to have to rebuild the whole thing all over again, which is what I had to do, which is partly why it took me a little bit longer to build this rig than last time. So just be careful and keep that in mind when you're building your own spline IKs. I learned that the hard way, but that's what this was for. I was doing this just to learn and share what I've learned. So if we go down to the legs, if you take a deep look at this rig, when you download it or use it, if you care at all, you'll notice that his legs use splines, but his arms use bendy bones. Why did I do that, you might wonder? Well, through a lot of trial and error, I found that it was better to keep the arms bendy bones because of the twisting and the different y-axis rotation for the arm at the elbow and everything. Easier to get that done with bendy bones because you just have to copy the rotations to 4 bones down a chain to get them to twist properly. But with spline IK, it's a lot more work to try to get the long ways. I mean, it's different orientation for each bone, but to get like the Y orientation twisting to work right, because right off the bat, and this was also something I found out through some tutorials and some research, is that with spline IKs, you can't just twist the controllers right off the bat, but you can see that it works on the spine. You can twist it. This was done through drivers. The entire length of the spine uses drivers. If I can find where I put them. It's a little harder to see. I think it's because I didn't, or if we go here, there we are. So I put some drivers all the way up and down the length of the spine to compensate for that limitation of spline IK. So you get that with the spine, but with the legs, you don't really have a lot of twisting going on. Even at the ankle, if I were to rotate this on the y-axis, it goes pretty far before you start to see really weird twisting and volume loss. It can go all the way out here, and it still looks relatively decent. And if you rotate it the other direction, it takes quite a lot for it to actually start twisting a little too much. If I were to do that on the arm, it would be a disaster, which it was when I first tried making this because the wrist did not twist properly. Even if I put some drivers on that whole long chain here, it would have been a pain in the neck to try to build, whereas on the legs, it's not very necessary. So this just has 6 bones down the chain on the spline IK because, kind of like similar to what I said about the spine, he's relatively low poly, even with subdivision turned on. With this topology here, you see he doesn't have many edge loops down the legs, so that way you can get a really rounded out, puffy squash and stretch throughout his thighs and calves. So that is why I did that. If you're wondering how I got the knees to bend so sharply with a spline IK, unlike the bendy bones, you can see here I set up drivers for it to pinch really sharply at the elbow, but on the knee, there is no drivers on any of these. Well, the way I did that, and this is probably one of the nicer things about spline IK over bendy bones, which is that I guess I will unhide this, and pardon the mess. I wish it didn't unhide everything every time I unhid that collection, but that's just how Blender likes to do it. But you can pretty clearly see it. I think all I had to do was go into the spline that controls this spline IK system on the legs, go to the middle joint where the knee is, and just shrink down the handles. I think I shrinked it all the way down to 0, so if you were to scale it back up again, it won't really do anything, but that's fine because you've got the extra points of articulation here on the spline, so you can see when you move it out, it moves the bones out as well. If you scale it up and down, it'll adjust the width of that curve. So that was a much simpler way of setting up the joints sharply as opposed to the bendy bones. And I was pretty happy with how that turned out. I thought that that was pretty slick. So, let's see what else I came up with for Coolio 2.0. I made his fingers and hands a little bit more complex. I also tried my best to make them deform a little bit better, just do some better weight painting. I also edited the geometry a little bit more than last time to try to get them to bend right. They're still not perfect, I will admit. Like, you can see his, the in between his fingers, the weight painting was just a little tricky to nail. But I think that it got the job done with how his hands were set up. So it's pretty much just similar to the first Coolio, how you've got this copy rotation all throughout the fingers, as well as an offset control for each individual knuckle. But I also added the finger spread. This is just set up with its own set of copy rotation. So you've got copy rotation between these knuckles and this controller, but then you have copy rotation between this controller and this controller. That's how you achieve that. And I'm trying to think of anything else. Oh, the UI, the little panels that I set up. I thought this, I still think that this is a little bit better than the first version of Coolio. While it might be impressive to have your own custom Python script in Blender to sort of create your own UI for something, I just find that this is a little bit prettier and more user-friendly. It's simpler, especially considering a lot of it wasn't necessary. I had a switch between FK and IK for the spine. You don't need that anymore. It's completely useless because you have both at the same time with this spine setup. So all that left was just these two plus the head tracking, the IK FK switch for the elbows and hands, and that was basically it. So with this setup, I was able to, add a little bit more cleanliness to the overall look of it, and you can even quiet down all of this noise going on here with some more control over the layers. So all I had to do to add even more control was just add these last two custom properties off to the side here, and I think that that is a decent compromise to keep things relatively simple. So I'm just trying to take a good look at him, see if there's anything else that I'm pretty excited about. Really, the two main takeaways, I guess there's really three, is the change in the UI, giving him these little panels, the spine, and the face. Those are, and well, yeah, the tweak bones. Like I said, this video isn't scripted. I'm just kind of going off the fly here. But those are like the really big things, is the spine and the face. I'm especially happy with how much better this seems to work than the original Coolio rig. You can manipulate everything all in the same layer as far as the spine is concerned, and the mouth, you can move everything in any which way you want, and it'll generally just look right. It just works. I'm pretty happy with it. So I will definitely be linking all of the resources and different ideas I got to sort of try and develop this on my own. The spine is, like I said, very, very derivative of a tutorial I found on Spline IK Spines. But I of course, I modified the proportions. I didn't follow it in, completely step by step just to try to completely duplicate it. But it is the same principles throughout it that gives you this level of control all on one layer without having to switch between FK and IK. And the face is kind of honestly, it's a more common setup than you might think, to have a combination of armature transformations and shape key. Usually on more realistic face rigs, you'll actually just have bones deforming the face, and then you'll have action groups for different poses as well as corrective shape keys, which will kind of give you the same effect where you have different shape keys for like different emotions, but it's all like half and half shape key and armature, whereas this is almost entirely just shape keys. Moving the mouth up and down and side to side completely all on its own is something I'm also pretty happy with, because it gives you much more cartoony looks, like you're drawing a mouth onto a sort of circular head kind of aesthetic going on. So from any angle you can kind of get him to move his mouth in such a way that is more pleasing to the eye from any perspective. Another thing about the mouth rig, as far as like inspirations and some different concepts that I've borrowed and sort of put into this, the lip sync panel that I put here, it is very similar to a rig I've seen in Maya that I was able to download for free thanks to a very generous animator. He used to do Game Grumps animated with 3D models. You'll probably recognize them when I link to it in the description of the video. But his Maya shape key controllers for the face, he had several panels going around here, but a main lip sync one was pretty much similar to this one. Kind of gives you the meow kind of movements when you move it all the way around. I thought that was a brilliant way of getting the basic sort of lip sync, like nouns, or excuse me, vowels. I know words, I'm smart. To get the vowels out right off the bat, and then manipulate the rest of the mouth to get like different shapes, different emotions, and whatnot. But instead of making all of these separate panels like the lip sync, I decided to keep them directly on the face, just so that way, I think that's more of a personal preference than anything else, just because you feel like you're actually manipulating part of the face rather than just going to a menu and saying move this bone this way, even though the results would basically be the same. I just think it's personal preference in designing a sort of user experience or a user interface when using a rig like this. So I think that's finally it. I'm pretty happy with this, and I'm very happy to finally move on to something else. I've been working on Coolio for a while now. I've had some medical issues going on that's kept me sort of preoccupied, so in my free time I've tried my best to complete this at a reasonable time frame as best I could, but now that he's done, I'm pretty happy with him. I'm pretty satisfied with how professional I think this is compared to the original Coolio, and I'm gonna move on to something else. I don't know what is coming next. I've got a few ideas. More than anything, I want to kind of branch out a little bit more, try something different, sort of diversify my skills. I definitely want to try making something in Maya. in this industry, it pays to know Maya. It's really it's standard for a reason. And also, a lot of the things that I wanted to do in Coolio 2.0 but just couldn't, or at least couldn't do reasonably, or within a reasonable time frame, or you know what I mean. You can do an automatic snapping between FK and IK poses in Blender, but that requires a lot of complex scripting that is just beyond my skill level. I decided that this basic transition between FK and IK is good enough. I think that for a free rig that you can modify all on your own if you wish to try and build your own additions to it, so long as I'm credited as the original creator of this rig, and you credit the original creators of this model, which I've edited. It was originally just this sort of stick figure. It was pretty much the same, except that it had no mouth, and I sort of added a little bit more depth to his head so he looks a little more humanoid. But I'm getting a little bit off topic here. I might need some more coffee. But in Maya, it's so much easier to set up something where you manipulate the IK and then switch to FK, and it'll look exactly the same. The only thing that'll change is how you control it after that, and they'll always be the same whether you switch to FK to IK or IK to FK. I would love for that to be in every rig. I think that would be supremely helpful, but that is some really complicated stuff that I'm not quite ready to do yet, unless I were to try to do it in Maya, where it is a little bit easier, since Maya is very script friendly and has just a lot more control over what each bone and controller can do. For instance, there's some cool things you can do in Maya, such as build sort of a zipper setup for the mouth, where you kind of have the open and closed shapes of the mouth go from left to right or right to left, almost like a zipper. This can be done in Blender, just like I said about the IKFK snapping. It's just so much easier in Maya from what I've seen, and I would love to try to actually achieve some of those things in Maya rather than try to just duplicate everything Maya can do in Blender. I think that it'll actually be better for my portfolio and for practical use to just do it in Maya than to try to copy it in Blender. Blender's great. I've used Blender for years. It's how I've learned everything about CG and rigging and modeling and animating. But sometimes, it's not the perfect tool for everything, as hard as it may try. It's great, but I definitely need to start branching out. So I think that's what I'm going to do next. I'm going to try to make an even better rig than this in Maya, but with a different character. I'm happy with Coolio, but I definitely want to move on from him. I've been looking at his beady-eyed little doughy face for way too long now, and I'm very excited to actually try something else. I've got a few other models I've got ready for rigging. Some I've downloaded that are a lot more like realistic, like Pixar-ish, that I'm pretty excited to try to make something with. So you can look forward to that later on as I continue to work on different projects. Or I could do some more two-dimensional work to really take a break from all this 3D rigging I've done with Coolio, just to take a breather, keep everything a little bit diversified, get some variety in my skills. But who knows? I'm going to take maybe a day or two, try to figure out my next project and what I should do, what I want to do, and try to find a happy medium between the two. I'm also really excited about Blender 2.93 Alpha's new grease pencil tools. The interpolation tools just look amazing. They look exactly like what I've been wishing Blender grease pencil had for years, is automatic in between strokes rather than between whole frames So I'm really excited to mess around with that, but it would be another Blender project rather than spreading out away from Blender. So I still need to figure some things out. So this video has gone on long enough, I think, with me rambling. Like I said, I wanted to just sort of take a breather and be a little more casual about how this rig works and how I made him and the choices I made to try to improve upon the first version. So I just sort of turned on my microphone, pushed record, and just started rambling into the microphone about this. It's not going to be my best video, but I hope that you can probably take away some information that you've learned, if you learned anything from it. And I'm definitely going to share every bit of inspiration and resource that I use to try to help me perfect this rig in every way I could. And I will see you next time. Yeah, thanks.